Today, we're talking about how prisons are designed to be invisible. This next story shines a light on one part of that system, how a third of people in prison have at least one disability, and how that's not part of the story most people hear about prisons. Our media and lawmakers don't often link these two issues, incarceration and disabilities. Cheryl Green shares this next story. Cheryl understands the power of pop culture in shaping public perception of marginalized people. She's a filmmaker. She just shot a documentary about artists who have traumatic brain injuries. Just a warning, this story has discussion of some pretty harsh realities. Cheryl will be talking about racist and ableist trauma, profiling, and a history of abuse. If you don't think you want to hear about that right now, just come back to this another time.
Before the Declaration of Independence was even signed, the fledgling United States of America already had mental institutions, taking people considered insane out of their homes and tucking them into specialized hospitals. Sometimes they got treatment, sometimes they were shackled, starved, and abused. People with psychiatric disabilities were jailed more often than placed in hospitals in the early days. In the 1830s, a Boston schoolteacher named Dorothea Dix took a job teaching people in prison in Massachusetts. While she didn't go into the job as an activist, what she saw in the prison appalled her. She started to report on how living conditions were brutal, and the people in prison, many with psychiatric disabilities, were abused and starved by their jailers. She started a movement that expanded the reach of our psychiatric hospitals, but it was no miracle fix. While a lot has changed in the last 180 years, patterns of abuse in long-term care facilities and jails repeat endlessly to this day. Right now, in the United States, there are more people with psychiatric disabilities in jail or prison than there are in psych hospitals, and incarcerated populations represent people with a huge array of physical, cognitive, and sensory impairments and deaf people. If she were around today, Dorothea Dix would be outraged at how it's once again easier to wind up behind bars than in a specialized hospital. Our current incarceration rates has something to do with our response to the abuse of institutions. In 1955, President John F. Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Act, a law intended to end the isolation and segregation of disabled people in archaic institutions by pushing funding out of institutions and into home and community-based care.
Almost every American family at some stage will experience or has experienced a case of mental affliction, and we have to offer something more than crowded custodial care in our state institutions. Our task is to prevent these conditions. Our next is to treat them more effectively and sympathetically in the patient's own community. I hope that Congress will act on this bill.
But even as the nation shut down institutions, funding for community care has still not reached levels needed to keep most people with complex care needs in their homes. We shuttered the warehouses and gave people nowhere to go. And as a culture, we never addressed the ableist biases that led us to want to lock up disabled people in the first place. The politics of who gets assigned a label of disability ties into racism, homophobia, and sexism. Until the 1970s, homosexuality was considered a mental illness and for many years a crime.
Then during lunch, Ralph showed him some pornographic pictures. Jimmy knew he shouldn't be interested, but, well, he was curious. What Jimmy didn't know was that Ralph was sick, a sickness that was not visible like smallpox, but no less dangerous and contagious, a sickness of the mind. You see, Ralph was a homosexual, a person who demands an intimate relationship with members of their own sex.
Many people who were LGBT were incarcerated in prisons and psych wards. Likewise, 19th century doctors had great confidence that the only reason an enslaved African or African American might run away was because they must be suffering an alleged mental illness that they called drapetomania. And we all know the fabulous diagnosis of hysteria, something that can only happen to someone with a uterus. In early 20th century thinking, someone's uterus, supposedly detached from its spot in the abdomen, navigated itself to the brain and destroyed the person's ability to think rationally. Today, these biases still all work tragically in tandem. Estimates now find that between 1/2 and 1/3 of people killed by police have a disability. For me, These aren't just distant statistics. They're a constant danger in my own community of people with disabilities from traumatic brain injury. I've seen friends with traumatic brain injuries be incarcerated instead of getting rehab when they've spiraled into houselessness, driving under the influence, attempting suicide, and abusing drugs, all common for a lot of people with TBI. Disability and deafness are often criminalized when people don't walk, talk, or respond to police in the way the officers expect them to. When I think specifically about why people who acquire their disability as adults like I did are more likely to wind up in jail than non-disabled people, I think back to the time I got kicked off an airplane in 2013. This was back when I used to get completely devastated when anyone changed my plans, something the brain injury really brought out in me. I had requested pre-boarding and then to have someone hoist my bag into the overhead bin for me, both of which are my rights under the law. They refused, and I imploded. I didn't want to cause a fuss, so I withdrew into a little ball. As my rage and frustration built, I crushed my glasses in my fist, obliterating them, and I refused to speak for fear that I'd only be able to scream. I was trying to make myself silent and invisible. But that was too much for the flight crew. They demanded I leave the plane, saying I was, quote, a safety hazard, and that the pilot refused to fly with someone who refused to communicate. When I made it back to the waiting area, I was in a sobbing rage. I threw my bags down and started cussing at the top of my lungs. Luckily, in cases of disability-related incidents, airlines are required by law to call in a specially trained complaints resolution official. The glasses I'd crushed had prism lenses to point my eyes in the same direction. Without them, the people, carts, and rolling bags were visually disorienting, and I kept getting lost trying to walk in a straight line. So the official held my hand as we walked to keep me from running into anyone. He got me a new ticket on the next flight. Then he led me to the employee lounge and let me wait there. When I got on my flight 5 hours later, I was too exhausted to care about my own frustrations. That made it easier to stay calm and follow orders and sit still. Thinking back to this incident, I know even though it wasn't a good situation, it could have turned out so much worse. Airports aren't exempt from police and TSA brutality. What kept it from escalating to that? I honestly believe it had a lot to do with the fact that I'm a small, cisgender, white woman. It's my privilege that kept me from being incarcerated. A lot of disabled people don't wind up as lucky as I was that day. The incarcerated population is 3 to 4 times more likely to report having a disability than non-incarcerated people. Storytellers from the Avid Prison Project report barriers they face that are pretty universal, such as having their wheelchairs taken away, being refused medical attention or prescriptions, and being punished and isolated instead of given accommodations, many of which are inexpensive and straightforward. Last year, I listened to activists and artists on a panel about race, disability, art, and incarceration held in Seattle. Dory and Taylor talked about their experiences being abused as a child and how their responses to abuse was seen as just acting out.
Well, first of all, I want to start out by saying that I feel really honored to be here because statistically, I should not be here right now. That is something that I think is important to start off this conversation with, is that statistically, these systems are designed to keep people like myself away from these environments, is to keep me institutionalized. One thing that is different when people mention the school to prison pipelines and when they mention different forms of incarceration is that when you grow up like I did, you were never told that you could do anything besides end up in an institution. My incarceration started with mental institutions at 9 years old.
As a Black Native American child labeled mentally ill instead of the victim of abuse, they got no counseling and care. Instead, they got incarceration in a mental institution and chemical incarceration through psychiatric drugs, leading to a cycle of isolation and further abuse. I used to go to a brain injury support group. Not long after my airport incident, a police chief came to our meeting to talk about police encounters. She told us about how we should wear medical alert bracelets listing our disabilities, so officers can ideally view us as disabled, not non-compliant. I ordered one online that same day. I was scared I might lash out in public again. I was afraid of a cop touching me. I was afraid of a cop punishing me for imploding and not responding, even though for me, it would be self-preservation. The bracelet said to speak slowly, quietly, and calmly. It said to write things down. I can't remember what else is said because I lost it. As many disability rights and justice activists state, this is not a matter of individual people's personal shortcomings, flaws, or failures. Disability and deafness are not, quote, what's wrong with you. Being disabled or deaf means existing in and creatively adapting to an inaccessible world while honoring and celebrating all aspects of your identity. Nowadays, I have much more self-control and I can communicate better under stress. With these added privileges, I don't have fear around my own situation anymore because I pass as non-disabled. Thanks are due to disability justice activists like those using the hashtag #DangerouslyDisabled on Twitter to share firsthand experiences around policing and incarcerating disabled and deaf people. Usually, in our media and pop culture, disability is considered a downer of a subject. Disability stories are considered niche, but they're not niche. Disabled people exist in every culture and community in the U.S. The imperative that we be hidden away in locked buildings is based on a culture's values, not a universal inevitability. It's up to us to keep up the fight for basic rights such as living in the community. And we can't stop there because disability rights are only part of one step in the call for disability justice.